So, we've heard, I think, from a range of different perspectives today, which has been, I hope, really useful to you. I've certainly found it really interesting. And before I sort of go into some of the questions, and there have been quite a few that have been coming through on Slido, and please keep them coming because I'll do my best to try and get through them. I thought I would just try and start and ask a question of each of our members of the panel with my old hat on. So we had hoped that my successor from the MOJ, the Director of Access to Justice Policy, might have been able to be here, and for very good reasons, I know she hasn't been able to. But I'm going to ask the panel what they would have liked to have heard from an MOJ representative, and indeed what they would want to say to an MOJ representative if they had been here. So briefly, I'll start perhaps, Kama, with you, and I'll move down the row.
Well, it won't come as a surprise that probably the first thing I'll talk about is funding and our underfunded criminal justice system. The Bar have been saying that, as have many other people working within it for decades, but it's really, really coming home to roost now. I was describing before that I have trials through to 2025. That is in part because of the closure of courtrooms, the underfunding in terms of appointing judges, and the fact that we are finally in the position which we always knew that we would be, where we no longer have enough criminal barristers to service the work, and trials are routinely adjourned now because there is no prosecution barrister available to do that. So that's the first thing. I think that the need then for Section 28, in fact, would be significantly reduced, because actually, if you asked most victims or witnesses, they would just want their trial quicker rather than to give evidence months before the trial. So that would be the first thing. It sounds like a very small thing, but the availability of conference rooms within the court building has a really knock-on effect in terms of delays. They're always locked. It doesn't matter how many times I go around with security and get them reopened. They end up locked again. So you when you're dealing with vulnerable people, you don't often and can't find a space to have a quiet consultation with them, and you're supposed to be building trust and developing relationships, and you end up having to discuss traumatic events in corridors and on stairwells, and it's entirely inappropriate. I'd like to see the demarcation between registered intermediaries and non-registered intermediaries gone. I don't understand the need for that whatsoever. And I better stop now because you want time for other questions.
Well, it's a nice segue because you've mentioned intermediaries, and William, you're next. So.
Yeah, I think we need to start thinking about what the outcomes look like and start to try to monitor that. I think our conversations that we're having, there's a move towards that, and I think that's important. There's an awareness problem with intermediary use. We're aware of massive discrepancies. I mean, the reason we've selected Leeds is because it's in the north of the country. One of the reasons that is because there is a big justice gap in our opinion, and our data suggests, for example, you're 3.5 times more likely to have an intermediary and a referral to be made in a criminal trial in London than you are in Newcastle or in the northeast. So there is clearly an awareness problem in different areas of the country. I think that needs addressing, and yeah, that's
Thank you.
some thinking points.
Yeah, it's a bit boring, but I'd probably just echo what's already been said, to be honest. I think that funding is obviously a massive issue, as is the provision of intermediaries, particularly as it gets to before the ABE interview, not afterwards, and also for suspects. Like, appropriate adult is not the same as an intermediary at the suspect interview stage. So that's...
Thank you, Katie. Edmore.
I think I can echo what others have said, but also to address the imbalance between what's available for witness and suspect, which is mainly an issue that hasn't been addressed for a long time.
And you made that point, I think, in relation to the balance between special measures in your presentation earlier, between witnesses, where it's very much, I think, commonplace, versus the lack of access perhaps to defendants who need exactly the same support or have similar difficulties. So I think that's a good point. I'm going to take a question from Slido now. Once I've found the one that well, there's a quick one here actually, which, William, if I can just quickly clarify this. There's a question here around the work of Communicourt and whether you work within the magistrates' courts and the entire courts and tribunal system, or just the Crown Court. Do you want to just give a quick answer to that one?
Yeah, so we're what used to be called a non-registered intermediary, which we've never understood, but we're now a managed and approved service provider on the HMCTS approved intermediary service framework, which means we work in all criminal courts with defendants, and we work across the family courts, civil courts and tribunals as well. However, the awareness, the referral levels are really low because of the awareness piece too.
And I think, I know he's not here, but His Honour Judge Clark also mentioned the need to think more broadly around the civil and the tribunal courts, and the tribunals, the civil courts and the tribunals. And when one thinks about the sorts of vulnerability that sits in tribunals, whether it's in mental health, whether it's in asylum, whether it's in special educational needs, I mean, it couldn't be more obvious perhaps in relation to those tribunals. And I just thought, perhaps Katie, in relation to your research, have you come across, have you found it easy to access examples outside of the criminal justice system?
Yeah, most of the work is in the criminal, there's limited work as it is, but that which exists. There's a couple of studies looking in the family, experiences in the family courts, and I feel like we opened a whole can of worms when we started this project. So we said we're not just going to do criminal courts for the first study, like tribunals and everything. So actually that was kind of quite a big familiarisation process with understanding how that works and the provision of special measures. Obviously, as you say, like different issues are involved in different courts and different types of trials. So if you've got a family case, for example, issues of credibility of systems and whether that person can have custody of that child is, so.
And we have recently just developed the training. So I spoke about the Inns of Court College of Advocacy training for advocacy and the vulnerable. That was a quasi-mandatory scheme because of the difficulties there'd been in trials, and so an obligation was taken on by the bar to train criminal barristers. You can't just reproduce the same training, as you say, for every discipline. So again, the ICA, the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, has recently developed the training, reworked the study for the family bar, and that is now being rolled out nationally across the family bar. But it's a huge job of work to develop the training, and I know very much they would like to expand that into the civil and tribunal service as well, but it's not imminent because it doesn't have the same push as there was from government for us to do that in the criminal justice system.
And it's difficult because there's often in those environments there's not necessarily a legal professional, they're not necessarily represented, and how does the intermediary role fit with all of that? There's a passage of time difference. Lots of tribunals happen very quickly. The first time you see them is when they've just walked into the tribunal centre building. So I think there are other logistical challenges there at the moment about how that would work in reality on the coalface, if you like.
Quite a lot of what you've, the three of you, and Edmore, feel free to jump in. What you've talked about actually doesn't necessarily require funding. It requires thinking a bit differently about how the current processes work. I wonder if you wanted to give a message to those of us that are here today to go out and spread the word. What would you do? What would you want us to say in order to raise that awareness and find ways which doesn't require millions of pounds to make a difference? Because I suspect there are. I mean, we've heard some of them already from you, but Edmore, do you want to have a think about that first?
Okay, so in the project, another aspect of my project was talking to intermediaries about their experiences, and I think some of them told me that they had been to tribunals after the introduction of the court appointment appointed intermediaries, and they said the judges in tribunals and were more receptive of intermediaries. During the ground rules, they engaged more than in criminal justice, in the criminal court. It seems like in the criminal court, there's already a perception that defendants are not entitled to any support, or they are still restrictive, and the system is more for formality, the ground rules here. But for them, they said that they found at the tribunal, the judge really tries to understand the issues. So I think there's an opportunity there for, if more people could have awareness that support is available for vulnerable witnesses, defendants in those proceedings, and start using them. It would be something that requires no resources, but maybe an efficient referral system.
Yeah, I think you make the tribunals have a reputation, I think, for traditionally being a little bit closer, I don't know if that's the right word, to understanding, and they were designed in that way. That's why they were the creation out of the civil courts. But I think, I mean, that your point about raising awareness and making sure we all go away, I guess, knowing and spreading the word of many of the messages we've heard today, is in itself obviously a great starting point. Who wants to add?
I was going to say just, I think not just having a little bit fluidity of thought sometimes, rather than just following the same patterns. Why do we do it in that way? You know, just so much of what we do just follows a pattern because that's what we saw other people do. You know, right from even like reading a police interview, it just was always the way that, you know, the counsel never played the part of the defendant, but read the part of the police officer. But why do we do it that way? Isn't it not better to control the answers and pause and focus on significant things? So just having a bit of independence of thought of why do we do it like that? Is there a different way that I could do it? And starting with asking the defendant or the witness what their concerns are, rather than coming at it the other way and saying, these are our list of solutions, how do I force you into one of them? Just asking the questions, not making assumptions. What is it that bothers you? You know, if there's something that you wake up worried about, what is it? It can often be really small things, you know, coming across people, bumping into them at bus stops or whatever. And there's really small things we can do to shift that. I think better training as well. We come back to that, don't we? I'd like better training still for the judiciary. I think they trust the bar sometimes to get it right, and then the bar push the boundaries about it. So I'd want to see better control there. And it does come back, I know, to funding, because even where that isn't the issue, the pressures of it means that a judge might not want to go through care in a ground rules hearing because he or she knows they've got another 5 cases to come in the list. So it ends up just creating a pressure that we don't need if we're going to do these cases right.
And the last minute nature of it is challenging as well. Funding is last minute. About, I think, over half of our bookings come within 2 weeks of the trial, which then doesn't give anyone any time to prepare.
No.
And you know, we were speaking the other day on a research when we was talking about the research about the things that change on the day, having ground rules hearings in the morning and then pulling away special recommendations that, you know, for somebody who, an autistic person, it's going to be really challenging to say, well, actually now you can't give evidence behind a screen, or those kind of things, the unknown. And I understand why it happens, because it's you know, the timescales are challenging for everyone involved, and the justice system is stretched. But the early intervention, the early recognition of the need for special measures to support that person through that process, so that they can prepare for what's going to happen.
I fight really hard to have at least a 7-day gap between ground rules hearing and the questioning.
How'd you get on?
Well, mostly okay, actually, because the 7 days has saved the cross-examination so often. We found that something hasn't been disclosed, or there's been a problem, and the urgency of that 7 days means that we've been able to resolve those issues within the week and keep the timetable on track. Whereas when we began doing them, we were doing ground rules hearing the day before on the same day. And I do say that we should always be asking for a week.
Yes.
I'm going to come back to training in a minute, but I just wanted that you raised the point, William, about the time frame, or the very short time frame between being basically assisting somebody and being told about being asked to do it. Katie, you made the point about disclosures and there being a reticence of that disclosure. What, for people to disclose, for example, in relation to autism, that they are autistic, what can proactively be done as part of the justice system to not put it just on the autistic people to be the person, to be responsible for disclosure? What could we do differently to try and get to the root of people's own needs as early as possible?
Yeah, I guess it's more of partly a cultural thing, and not the sort of thing that can just happen overnight. You know, I know some police forces have a mandatory question about, do you have autism on their booking in? Not all do, some do. Yeah. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the answer. No. It's not necessarily because they haven't thought to say it, it's actually they don't want to say it. So I think understand, like, just a sort of a shift in culture and how it's perceived their diagnosis will be taken, and the accommodations that will be made for them. I think it's something that will just happen over, you know, it needs time to, and changes that happen alongside that will then hopefully make them feel more comfortable in order to be able to make the diagnosis, knowing that they'll be understood better. And just coming back to your point about training as well, I think that's a really important, big issue. And the problem with training as well is it's not just a tick box thing, you know? Yeah. Because in order to make those more tailored adjustments, that's not just, right, we've got a list of adjustments here, which one can we do, as you highlighted so well earlier, Kama, is an individual needs to have that level of understanding to be able to be flexible and you know, tailored to what needs to be done.
So talking about training and being flexible, and sorry, I don't mean it to sound in the way I'm about to make it sound. There's a question here about judges needing training, about presenting their summings up, and around there being ignored information about people and how they manage information. So we're now sort of, the questioner here is talking about jury members, but we've heard earlier that it's not just the defendant and the witness in court. There are a myriad of various people, including jurors in tribunals. There will be lay people, etc., who might even be judging the cases. What do we need to think about? What do we need to expect in relation to what could judges do to, I suppose, improve on what currently happens? Kama, I'm going to start with you and then William.
Well, I do think that the training could be improved. I actually would have liked to have seen the judges have to do the really intense advocacy training that we meted out to the bar, because most of the judges haven't been at the bar or been a solicitor during this process. Yeah. And they are the ones then who have to check the questioning for tags and leading questions and multiple questions, etc., with all those skills which actually they didn't use at the bar. So the newest judges will have had that training, who've just been appointed, but most of them wouldn't. So I actually would have liked to have seen them do that intense training and actually have their work marked by us, but there was a little bit of resistance, so that they haven't done that. And then the other thing that we can do, of course, is to improve the directions that are given to the jury, the formal directions, and that's a work in progress. There's a big body of work going on at the moment with the Law Commission in terms of sexual offences. I'd like to see a number of the directions changed so they are formally directed to consider certain aspects, to consider those special needs, to not hold that against them, for example, the laughing or the joking or the anger. And I think we could firm up some of those directions, which then become part of the formal judicial compendium, and then we're not as reliant on an individual judge to include that, but they have some formal guidance. That's what I'd like to see.
I come at this from a little bit of a different angle because I'm not a lawyer, but the majority of people that we're working with don't have a piece of paper that says that they have so-and-so diagnosis, or you know, it's not just the justice system that's stretched, all of the public service is stretched at the moment, so the chance of somebody coming to you who's got support services wrapped around them is probably unlikely. So I think for me it's the stuff we've been talking about today. It's about recognising the presentation of those needs and how they might bubble over or erupt a little bit, and then really digging down underneath some of that to understand, well, is there a communication problem there? Is there a mental health condition that's affecting them? Or is there something else going on, rather than just seeing the thing that's in front of you, which is the person throwing the chair, or the, you know, or the person who looks like they're disinterested or is laughing in the witness box. Or so those recognising when somebody has a communication need, or when somebody has some other need that means that they present in that way because of anxiety or all sorts of other things. I think it's about upskilling, where we can, people to recognise that that is not because of disinterest or because of flippancy or those kind of things, but it's actually because of something else going on that's under the surface.
I want to just touch on the changes over the last few years, specifically following COVID and the massive increase of virtual working and the impact that may have had. Edmore, can I go to you first? What for you has been some of the biggest impacts that you've seen?
From virtual working is for people with neurodiverse conditions. For some, it's a benefit because maybe they may not want to be seen in the courtroom, and it can be a benefit for them to participate virtually. But for some, it's a challenge because technology. They don't have the technology, they don't understand how it works, so it can be an added stressor of having to do things virtually. So it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah, so it may have improved situations for some, and for others it's really pushed it backwards or made it harder. Anyone want to add to that?
I think COVID was a shock to all of us, and that's no surprise. But we spoke to judges and things at the time, all via, you know, from our homes and via video link in whatever month it was in 2020. I mean, if you'd have asked Communicourt, can you do an assessment remotely in 2019, we probably would have said no. We all had to adapt, I think, and it means that we can access people quicker, which is good for the timescales. But there are times when you do need to do, if you're registered intermediary working with a young child, I imagine that you'd have to do that face to face. The conversations that we were having with judges at the time is, it's very easy to remember that I work in an office with 2 screens and a nice webcam and all of those kind of things, and it's comfortable. I've got a cup of tea, and that's very different to some of the vulnerable service users that we were working with or are working with, who are probably accessing this court hearing via CBP on a phone with a smashed screen or something, and the doorbell's going and all those kind of things. And I think it's just understanding what that environment feels like and looks like, because it's very easy to remember the environment, to sort of lull yourself into a false sense of security about the environment that you're in, which is very different to the person who's in a small flat with a limited technology and a cheap phone with a smash screen, all those kind of things that that I think we can sometimes forget if we're not careful.
I think that packed pressure that Andy talked about earlier, it's maintaining that ability to empathise as much as possible and to be curious, I suppose, about how other people live in this world. Kama, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, digital working has facilitated some work over the pandemic that we had to do over some family cases. At the start of the pandemic, we did a finding of fact in relation to a rape case entirely online, with all the testimony online and the judge making that decision. I understood the need for it in the pandemic. I don't think it's the way to go in terms of administrative hearings or, engagement for small things that need to be sorted out. It absolutely has its place. But human beings, we're sociable people. We don't even know the extent, I don't think, of how much we take into account, the unconscious clues that we get, that sense of someone, that feeling of someone. We're asking judges and juries, tribunals to make decisions, life-changing decisions, based on their view of the credibility of someone. And I think we lose quite a lot of that digitally. So as much as I recognise it has its place for some hearings, it's not the future for me, for our justice systems at all. It's something, in another role, I had to interview for quite a significant position in a hospital, and most of the candidates were face-to-face, and some were online, and I had to remind ourselves and the panel frequently to ensure that we had some balance in relation to that, because the candidates who were in the room had just so much more impact, and you could build that rapport so much more easily. I think particularly where you're building relationships that require trust, face-to-face really is the key. Sometimes then you might have to quick question and you want to clarify something online or over the phone or by email, that's fine, but that's only really works once you've got that relationship of trust.
And I think, like you say, there's administrative hearings, it makes sense. A professionals meeting can be done online. I think if we had to come up with a rule, it would be anything that involves any live evidence, then it should be done face-to-face where possible, because this is the most important part of somebody's life. So if we have to make an effort to be in a room together, then we should. Because there's all sorts of parts of, like you say, communication and body language and all sorts of things that play into that.
And you can't really sort of take them into account.
No, you can't.
No. I mean, in decades or hundreds of years, we might have developed all of those skills and, be able to do that. But right now, as humans, I don't think we can.
Well, Elon Musk is saying we're not going to be working in the future, so maybe we'll have more time to understand each other. Might be a silver lining in that. So there's lots of questions. I'm looking, not down at my phone at messages other than Slido, I hasten to add. But there's lots of, I think, messages here around the judge's role and what is and isn't understood by judges, what isn't used by judges to assist other people in the courtroom. So I'm not going to read them all out, but we'll perhaps do our best to answer those longer in a longer time frame. What I did want to there's a quick question here which I've now just lost, which was for you, William. But basically it was around, but bearing in mind one of the messages we said, if you all go away and be aware of the various support mechanisms that are in place, the question was I'm paraphrasing, how do we go about knowing what support services there are? How do people go about contacting organisations such as Communicourt?
Well, Communicourt can be contacted. We're in Birmingham, but we're national service. We've got a phone service. We've got people on the phones. We've got a portal that you can use to make referrals. We at the moment receive around 5,000 referrals a year, so quite a lot of referrals to our service. Slowly catching up with the registered intermediary scheme, I think. Please just get in touch with us. I suppose we're only one part of special measures that are available. There's other special measures that the lawyers in the room will be aware of that aren't intermediaries, and that's a legal professional's decision about what is appropriate. And who am I to say? I'm not a lawyer, so I suppose there's other services, advocacy services, and things that might be able to support, depending on what the needs are. I think the biggest problem is that, like I said before, most of the people that intermediaries are working with don't have diagnoses, or at least over half. And therefore it's quite hard to spot vulnerability. Vulnerability is something that's really hard to define and then apply to the person that's in front of you that's just walked into the solicitor's office. So I think it's a challenge. I suppose what an intermediary will do is find out what those communication needs are, if that's appropriate, and that's a discussion for the lawyers in the room with the judges in those cases.
And not just in the criminal justice system, because I have noticed
Yes,
there's been a few people saying there's been a big focus on criminal justice, and rightly so. We should remember that there are other jurisdictions.
And 2/3 of our referrals have come from the family courts, or do come from the family court. So, 2011 when Communicourt was founded, it was all criminal referrals. Actually, the criminal stuff has sort of plateaued and bobbled about over the years. It's the family court stuff that's gone, has really grown, and like I say, that's about 2/3 of our referrals now.
In terms of the where you can get information from, again, just slightly trying to put my MOJ hat back on, there's quite a lot of work that the MOJ are thinking about in terms of health justice partnerships, thinking about areas where the same individuals have touch points with other services. Is there something you would like to see? Are there places, the obvious places where, I don't know, a little poster up or a signposting from a professional that's not a lawyer, but that is interacting through a range of different ways? Is there something different you'd like to see there? Katie, I don't know if your research has, whether you focus entirely on from a courts-based perspective, or whether you've got a different perspective as well.
We're mainly focusing on
Yeah.
the court aspect. But,
William, where would you like to see
Well,
yourself
I'll plug
advertised
our
and
own
others?
stuff, but we have the access brief, which is here. There's lots of great resources on there about what different needs are. It's been created in conjunction with other organisations, the specialists, if you like. So STAMA and Autism Project and things. So please go on there and find. There's some stuff that's sort of in two parts at the moment. There's some 2-page, 3-page documents pick up. I've got 3 minutes. How do I just upskill myself really quickly for legal professionals? So there's the stuff about the diagnoses or the communication need, and then there's some things on there about how a ground rules hearing, tips for ground rules hearing, or tips for recognising communication needs, or I'm trying to think of on the top of my head some of the other things. But there's about 40 documents on there. Please go and make it's a great resource for anybody who would like to use it. It will always be free. We're not going to start charging for it next week. It's there because we recognise that intermediaries can't be in every single case, and therefore how can we upskill legal professionals? That training piece around, we know legal professionals don't have much time, so how can we give them a 5-minute document that they can go and pick up and just get the key things from about the problem that they're having at that time.
I'm going to draw us to a close with a question from Slido, because I'm hoping it will perhaps send us on a positive note, which is, what is the most exciting or important development in accessibility in courts? And that means, I think, civil, family, tribunal, criminal, in the last 5 years, and what can we look forward to? Edmore, can I unfairly start with you?
Okay.
Might have to go further back, I think, than 5 years.
Possibly. You can, if you want to go. I think that's
We
fair
haven't
enough.
done a huge amount since the pandemic, I don't think.
No.
Shall I start?
Go on, William.
I think what has been positive has been the introduction of the HIAC, the formalization of non-registered income. It hasn't addressed the statutory limitations to the law, but just because now they are formal and they are credited, it's something that is positive that can be built it's no longer just on an ad hoc basis. So at least you know that if you are looking for an intermediary as a defendant, you have somebody who has the right qualifications and has an approval from the MOJ.
William, that is possibly a good segue to you, and then maybe Katie. And
Yeah, I think
Kama.
Edmore took the words out of my mouth. I've worked in this space since 2016, and Communicourt's been in this space since 2011. There was a judge, a family judge, who I won't name, but there was a family judge many years ago who we said, well, what do you do about funding if you need an intermediary? And he said, well, we just don't have a new carpet. And I think the funding of intermediaries has been a challenge for the last 10 years. It's been a challenge on both sides. It's a challenge for Ministry of Justice, it's a challenge for HMCTS, and it's been a challenge for us at times. That the formalisation of intermediaries, I don't think we're quite there yet, because we still have registered and not non-registered anymore, but it's still there is still a perception gap about what an intermediary is and what that means. But I think we've made good headway. It's something that we have been lobbying for a long time, is to have some formalisation about what an intermediary is. You know, that they should have DBS checks and things is a good addition, and we're getting to a stage now where there is starting to be a data pool around how intermediaries are being used, which is useful for crafting the next wave of what intermediaries in the justice system look like. So yeah, thank you, Edmore took the words out of my mouth really, but at least it wasn't me saying it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like you say, there's not much in the last 5 years, but that would definitely be probably up there with the main one, I think. I think, like you say, it's not perfect, but there is discussions now about how we can match up a bit more, and I think it's, you know, got the ball in motion.
Yes.
You're 6 months into your research. If you were to, I mean, this is possibly deeply unfair, but if looking forward 5 years, what would you hope to see?
In terms of actually what's changed,
Yeah.
I'd say, yeah, more understanding, recognition of the need for tailored adjustments across the board, not just for witnesses.
Thank you. Kama.
Yeah, I mean, stuff that we've covered really. There's been a sea change, I think. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Over the course of my practice, there's been a sea change. And in the vast majority of cases, I feel as though witnesses, defendants with special needs and vulnerability are definitely treated better and have more opportunity to give their account than they did 10 years ago. So the shift has been in that period. So not very much post-COVID, but in the few years before that, it's been quite dramatic, I think. The introduction and the accessibility of intermediaries, the shift in the training and the advocacy in the vulnerable course has made a material difference. We have a long way to go so that those principles are not routinely applied. I've recently had experience of being in trials where I felt I was back in the 1990s. Genuinely, you know, with sort of no control over questioning and things like that. But the majority of judges, the majority of cases do have an eye on that. And it has developed some positive things. So, you know, I've had clients, we talk about before about them not, you know, having or being volunteering their diagnosis. They may not even know that might have been completely missed throughout. And I've definitely had clients who we just start asking the question, how did you get on at school? Did you like people? Just asking those general questions has led to some assessments and assistance and support and a diagnosis of ADHD and conditions where they've had real then access to the right support, which actually they would never have got if they hadn't been defendants in the criminal justice system. And, you know, they had never had that throughout their education. So every now and then there's a very, very positive story that comes out.
Thank you, Kama. That was a great way to wrap up, albeit that I think the key message is there's lots of work to be done, and I think on behalf of both William and I, we certainly want to encourage as much discussion and further action. I say that probably on behalf of everybody on this panel, although I'm always mindful not to put words into other people's mouths. I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you so much to our panellists now for all of your, not just what you've said now, but indeed for your presentations. I'll hand back to William. Thank you very much.
Thank you.